Hi everyone, this is Mia, and this is a video showing me speed painting and finishing up the watercolor painting I made of Hermione reading the history of magic and writing an essay on the Goblin Rebellion for Professor Binns. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan and hence this fan art. As I mentioned before, I made this initial painting in watercolor on paper. I like working with traditional media, however, I'm quite proficient in Photoshop because of my background in photography. I use Photoshop mainly to add extra color and to add light and shadow. The first step in this painting is to fill in the empty spaces I have with the content-aware fill tool. Because I want this painting to occupy the entire print and not have those empty spaces on the edges. Once this is done, I'm introducing a black and white layer. This black and white layer is only for me to visualize the tones in the painting. Sometimes I find that my finished image is too flat in its tonal range, and the best way to find out whether or not you have this problem is to constantly look at your image in progress in black and white. A black and white image will immediately tell you if your picture is flat. With the black and white layer on, I'm adding light and shadow to the image using curves and level layers. Light and shadow also gives the picture a three-dimensional quality, as you can see from the clock. After adding some shadow and light to it, it looks like the clock is actually on the wall. When I used the content-aware fill tool, I noticed that I didn't like some of the results. I tried using a layer mask to get rid of this, but I didn't like what was under that layer. So I ended up using a clone tool instead. When I was working with watercolors on this painting, I used a masking fluid for the first time for the moon and the stars outside the window. It wasn't as sharp as I wanted it to be, so I have to clean it up now in post. Instead of using this clone stamp tool here, I just sampled the color around the moon and used that color to draw around the image. I like rotating the image in Photoshop to make drawing easier for myself. I use a Surface Pro 4, so I use both my fingers to pinch and rotate. I'm adding some color to the moon in a new layer, and I have set the blending mode of this layer to darken. Because I'm using the darken blending mode, I don't have to be too careful when I'm using the brush tool to fill in the moon and the stars. This is because the light yellow I'm using for the moon is lighter than the blue night sky. Because the blending mode is set to darken, if I use the light yellow over the yellow won't show up. Only a color darker than the blue sky will show up while using the darken blending mode. Hermione has brown eyes, so in a new layer I'm drawing in her eyes brown. I just sampled the color of her hair to get the brown for her eyes. I'm using white for the highlight in her eyes. I like using white as the highlight in the eyes because white is the lightest color and the viewer's eyes are usually drawn to the lightest color in the picture. I want the viewer to always look at the subject first, and so this works well for me. I'm again turning on black and white layer and adding light and shadow. It looks too harsh when I turn the colors back on, so I still need to work on that. The light I noticed is not getting the yellowish hue of tungsten, so I'm adding the yellow highlight and using Gaussian blur to blur the harsh brush strokes. I'm also adding some blue light because it's nighttime. Hermione is reading the history of magic. It isn't possible to make such a small print in watercolor because this painting is quite small to begin with, so Photoshop is a great place to create such minute details. Now for the essay itself, Hermione is always ahead of schedule. So in her third year's summer vacation, she's already studying the Goblin Rebellion, which will only be covered in her fourth year at Hogwarts. The print detail won't be seen unless I print it large, but that's all right. I also wrote in a couple of lines about the rebellion, but I forgot to record when I was doing that. Some more light changes, adding yellow to the highlights and blue to the shadow. Yeah, and now I'm trying to change the overall color to make it look more like it's nighttime. Here again, I'm adding the details of the book, History of Magic. I wanted it to kind of pop out of the book, so that's why I made it fluorescent yellow, so you can see it. This is on the parchment, writing the essay, The Goblin Rebellion. I was writing it by hand. I wasn't using any text, so I had to, do it a couple of times. Of course, this is signed Hermione Granger. And I also wrote in a couple of lines about it. As I mentioned before, I didn't record that part of it. Making some more changes to the eyes, some highlights and some shadow onto the hair. Changing the color of the picture again, using curves. Curves is one of my favorite tools. Overall light and shadow changes again. This is pretty much all that I do towards the end. I'm constantly changing how the light and the shadow falls. Yeah, I made a mistake when I was drawing on pen and paper, so I had to correct that in Photoshop too. There was a little bit of a line sticking out. Right now I'm changing the overall light in the picture, where the directional light is coming from. And that's it. I'm done. Thanks for watching.